live. It is the 3rd of February 2025. I am reading Prelude to the Landing on Planet Earth. It was published in 1977 by STUART HOLROYD, and I read in the first reading the sleeve notes and the author's note. This is a journey through the Middle East largely. Chapter 1, Preposterous Propositions. How this bizarre story is going to end is, at the time of writing, anybody's guess. But let me go back to how it began, at least for me. On a visit to the United States in January 1975, I was staying with a friend in Rockland County, some 30 miles upriver from New York, and happened to mention that a friend in London had given me the phone number of Sir John Whitmore, who was living somewhere in New York State, at a place called Ossining. That's just across the river, my friend said, so we called up Sir John and arranged to go over to Ossining for lunch the following Sunday. In the spring of 1974, Whitmore and others had organized in London a symposium and a series of public lectures on the frontiers of science and medicine, which I attended in order to write some article on the proceedings. I had met John. In future reference I'll drop the honorific, as he had chosen to do, several times in the course of the May lectures, and subsequently on one or two occasions, but at the time I knew a little of his background or work. We were not close acquaintances, but since we were, as I thought, fortuitously in the same area, it seemed natural to pay him a social visit. Ossining. The name rang a bell, but I couldn't recall in what connection. I kept scanning my memory banks for the connection on and off all through the Saturday, but it continued to elude me. I didn't worry too much at it, though, particularly as the Saturday drew on, for my host, Richard Connolly, and I spent the afternoon and early evening at the Hightor vineyards as guests of the viticulteur Father Tom Hayes, who plied us with his excellent Hightor wines, which we contentedly discussed, drank and compared for hours, sitting cosily around a log fire while outside snow lay thick on the hillsides, which may seem a digression, but when you are into something as weird as I am the present time, it can be helpful to establish your credentials as a fellow with a taste for normal earthly and rational pursuits, such as drinking and talking about wine. The combination of jet lag and Tom Hayes' Hightor Reds ensured me a good night's sleep on the Saturday, so on Sunday we arrived in good time for lunch at Ossining. When I saw the mailbox outside the house we had been directed to, it bore the name Puharich. The connection had eluded me came back in a flash. This was the home of Andrija Puharich, the maverick scientist who had brought Uri Geller to America, and whose book Uri, which I had read some months before, recounted some very queer goings-on at Ossining. But as materializations and disappearance, reappearance events, as well as telling a very tall story about communication with extraterrestrial intelligences and sightings of UFOs. I had met Puharich briefly in London at the May lectures, where he had given a literally incredible talk in which he solemnly declared that he and Geller had been contacted by extraterrestrial beings to bear witness to their existence and their powers, and to prepare mankind for a meeting with these beings at some unspecified future date, when they would make mass landings on Earth. Subsequently, I had done some homework on Puharich in order to write my article, and also because my interest in the man was aroused, and found that he had done some very original and impressive parapsychological research work on correlations between environmental, electromagnetic forces, field forces, and process of paranormal cognition, had scientifically investigated some of the outstanding psychics of recent years, such as Eileen Garrett, Peter Hurkos, and the Brazilian miracle healer Andrija, and had invented an electrical device for applying radio waves of controlled frequency directly to the skin, which could be used for alleviating deafness, accelerating healing of bone fractures, and controlling blood clotting. The man was clearly a highly original, gifted, and versatile scientist, and I would have thought nobody's fool. But it was equally clear that he had made something of a fool of himself in the eyes of the scientific community by writing as sensationally as he did about Geller and UFOs and contact with beings from other parts of the cosmos. I had heard various opinions of him expressed, ranging from admiration to regret, a good mind gone off at a tangent, and derision, a classic case of omnipotence fantasy. But I didn't know what to make of the man. It would be interesting to meet him again on his home ground, though I filled Richard in on some of his background as we drove up to the big, detached house, and while we waited for someone to answer our ring at the door. John Whitmore answered and welcomed us warmly. John is tall, athletic, fair-haired, about 40, wears a neat beard, talks and moves energetically, and has successfully shed his past persona of public schoolboy, Sandhurst, subaltern, professional racing driver, country gentleman, and international tycoon. His manner and dress are casual, his speech is English with some American overtones and turns of phrase, and he's outgoing and enthusiastic. Some people also think he's crazy, but that's the point on which I think we had better withhold judgment. So John took us into a big sitting room where there were some plush couches and chairs, and the atmosphere was a bit unlived in and lacking the clutter of a home, except that a solitary bottle of Vic Vaporub stood out conspicuously on a low table. He introduced us to a pretty oriental-looking young woman named Melanie, whose manner was almost overwhelmingly effusive, intimate and caring right from the first moment, but who for the rest of the day kept getting my name wrong and calling me Stephen. John mentioned that Melanie had worked with Andrija and Yuri, and I recalled that she was frequently mentioned in Puharich Geller's book. Puharich himself wasn't around. He was in bed, suffering from some minor malady that we gathered Melanie thought was symptomatic of nervous exhaustion and overwork, and for which she had prescribed total rest. So he wouldn't be down, which was a pity, though if he had been, I wonder if he would have got a word in, for as soon as we got through the initial pleasantries, John launched into what was virtually a monologue, which was to keep Richard and me pretty enthralled for the next 3 hours. The enthrallment, in fact, might have been total if we had had a bottle of high tour to pass back and forth, and some definite prospect of the lunch we had been invited for. Noises suggested of preparation for the latter event emanated from a distant part of the house. Clattering of crockery, chattering of women's voices, but nobody came in to announce that lunch was served. A toddler came into the room a couple of times in the 3 hours, and a young woman, presumably the mother, appeared and whisked the child away. There were 4 women in the house, John explained, and 3 of them were psychics who were helping with the work. They lived as a community, and he had bought a neighboring house which he would show us in due course. The 2 houses comprised a small estate, and they were putting 2 acres of land under cultivation so that they could grow their own food. Their ultimate aim was the community should be as self-sufficient as possible. They had even installed a generator and laid down several thousand gallons of diesel fuel. The purpose of all this was that if any crisis arose, they would be able to continue with the work they were engaged on. Richard and I were intrigued. What work could involve a renegade and prodigal English aristocrat and a maverick American scientist shutting themselves away in Ossini with 4 women? Well, John said he was going to tell us, because although a lot of the work was still highly confidential, the time was coming when it would have to be more widely known. Even though those involved still had some doubts about the source and nature of the information, They felt the time had come when they had to lay their reputation on the line and, with appropriate reticence, seek means of getting the information across to more people. Maybe I would be able to help. John had liked the fair and open-minded way I had written up the May lectures material, so that at the time of sending us away thinking him nuts, he was going to tell us. So at the risk of sending us away thinking him nuts, he was going to tell us. I was familiar with the general situation already, having heard Andrija's talk in London and read his book on Yuri. But Andrija had only told a fraction of the story. Since March 1974, they had been in constant contact with the management, i.e. the extraterrestrial intelligences, and they now had tape recordings of over 100 hours of communications with them. I recalled that in Andrija's book there was quite a lot about communications with extraterrestrials. Andrija and Yuri had found that if they placed the tape recorder on the table between them and waited, sometimes the start button would be pressed down by some paranormal agency and a message would be imprinted directly on the tape. Two-way conversations had also been held in this way, some of which Andrija had transcribed verbatim in his book. But unfortunately, none of these recordings were available for others to hear, for as soon as Andrija had transcribed their contents, the cassettes had dematerialized. Very conveniently. Andrija's critics had mocked, but that was a point which I had wondered about. If Andrija were simply a liar, he could, with his expertise in electronics, quite easily have produced some recordings of synthetic speech to support his claim. But by claiming that these beings he was in contact with first directly imprinted speech sounds on tape, then made the cassettes dematerialize, he was compounding improbabilities, and certainly not speaking in a manner calculated to enhance his own credibility. I had puzzled over that without reaching any plausible explanation of Andrija's motivation, other than the most absurd one, that he was telling the truth. But now it seemed the management had become less coy, and had allowed 100 hours of their communications to remain intact on tape. That really was rather interesting, because to synthesize that much speech out of electronic signals would have been no mean task. But John explained that it wasn't exactly like that. In the present case, the management had preferred to use human channels, that is, mediums in deep trance. That, I thought, was disappointing. I had read quite a bit about trance mediumship and spiritualism, and knew that although there were a few classic cases that still defied explanation, most of the phenomena could be explained in terms of abnormal psychology or extrasensory perception. A century of psycho research and tens of thousands of hours of communications with alleged discarnate I was prepared for a low battery. If it was attested only by mediumistic phenomena, must be equally, if not more, dubious. I kept these thoughts to myself, because you don't argue rationally with a man once you begin to suspect he's just a misguided crank. But John must have either anticipated or intuited my objections, for he went on to explain that he had gone through months of doubt and suspicion, during which he had examined every possible explanation of the communications that he could think of, that they emanated from the medium's subconscious mind, that they came telepathically from the participants, particularly Andrija, and even that the whole thing was a hoax, designed to relieve him of some of his considerable inherited fortune. And finally, he'd had to reject all these normal explanations and accept the communications at their face value. Of course, he expected others to have the same problems and questions as he had had, and he didn't expect others to make the same kind of commitment as he was making, for as he saw it, He had nothing to lose except his money, whereas others might feel they had that commitment would put their reputations, their careers, and even their families' lives in jeopardy. Andrija was a case in point. He had lost much more than he could possibly have gained by his involvement. His professional credibility was tarnished, and his previous work in this area had not helped his marriage. There were in fact quite a few eminent people who knew about the work and would probably become active in it at the right time, but who for the present had to sit on the fence in order to safeguard their professional integrity and credibility. As far as he himself was concerned, John felt that the wealth he had inherited and the freedom of movement and independence it had given him had been a preparation for the role he was to play. The main thing that had convinced him that the communications were not a run-of-the-mill psychical phenomenon, but emanated from an external source, was the range and variety of the information they conveyed. The management had been observers of the Earth's history for millennia, and had intervened in it on several occasions in the past, and their communications contained a wealth of details about the origins and progress of civilizations, the origins of languages and mythologies, and the roles of historical figures. Also, there was an entire cosmology comprising information about 5 different extraterrestrial civilizations, their interrelations, their technologies, and about how the Earth related to this cosmic scheme. The management knew about contemporary political situations and events on Earth, and sometimes gave some intriguing information about what went on behind the scenes, and they were particularly concerned about the Middle East situation. And there was much more. There were other areas and subjects. There was a lot of wisdom and coherent teaching, and it was inconceivable, John thought, that all this could have emanated from the mind of the medium, or any of the participants, or even from them all collectively. He had asked all the obvious questions about the provenance of the material, and now he was 95% satisfied that the communications were what they claimed to be, and he was prepared to put in abeyance the residual 5% of doubt, or rather incredulity, and come right out and declare in appropriate circles in the near future that he and the others at Ossining were in contact with beings from another part of the cosmos, who were benevolently disposed towards the inhabitants of Earth, and were going to be among us in the near future in order to provide the guidance that we urgently needed at this critical juncture in history. Richard and I, as may be imagined, were somewhat stunned to be regaled with all this instead of with the anticipated lunch. It was fascinating. It was a fascinating experience, something it would be fun to write home about, and I enjoyed the novelty and irony of being able to do the old British act of showing off one of our aristocratic eccentrics to our American cousins in a situation that had the additional piquancy of taking place right on the American cousin's doorstep. Well, we all have our subjective defense mechanisms against novelty and strangeness, and mine were such thoughts as these. The Queen and Alice in Wonderland reproached Alice for not having had enough practice in believing impossible things, and boasted that she sometimes believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. Well, we were being asked to believe as many before lunch, and although I, at least, had had some recent practice in suspending disbelief, I was still far from graduating in sheer credulity, and certainly wasn't prepared for the challenges of this particular wonderland. My sympathies were with Alice. About 3 o'clock Melanie came in and asked if anyone would like to eat, as if it were a novel idea that had just occurred to her. So we went into another room where about 10 people were already assembled around a big big table colourfully laden with wholesome salads, cheeses, fruit and home-baked brown loaves. Conversation over lunch was largely about the absent Andrija, about how he tended to take too much on himself and how other members of the community might in future unobtrusively relieve him of some of the work. I sat between John and an elderly lady who turned to me once and volunteered the information that some days ago she had seen a cigar-shaped UFO hovering over Manhattan and was silent throughout the rest of the meal. After lunch, John took us around the estate. His own house was about 200 yards from Andrija's. Down a driveway and between the two lay a small lake. Adjoining his house was a large barn, which was in the process of being converted into a studio office with living quarters for guests. The house, the conversion, the big generator, the tanks of stored fuel, the land under cultivation, all bespoke a substantial capital investment in the work. Finally, we were shown the place where it all happened, the cage. I had read in Andrija's book, Beyond Telepathy, about the use of a Faraday cage in his experiments with Eileen Garrett, but this was the first time I had seen such a structure. Their Faraday cage is a rectangular metal box of dimensions 8 by 8 by 12 feet, which is lined with copper and placed on insulating supports and constitutes a complete electrical vacuum. When the door is shut, no electromagnetic waves can penetrate the cage, and the electrical environment within the cage can be controlled for experimental purposes. Inside the cage there were 3 chairs and a table on which stood some expensive-looking recording equipment and a small portable TV set. John demonstrated the electromagnetic shielding property of the cage by switching on the TV set and slowly shutting the door of the cage. The picture remained on the screen up to the point when there was just about a 1/4-inch crack for the signal to get through. Then John sharply pulled the door shut. The screen became blank and I caught in Richard's eyes a fleeting expression of claustrophobic alarm, which I confess I momentarily felt too. I thought of Kurt Vonnegut's Billy Pilgrim in the novel Slaughterhouse-Five, who had been kidnapped by the little green men of the planet Trafalmador and caged in their zoo. There was an interesting story about how they had acquired the cage, John said. Some time ago they had been having some technological difficulties in the communication session, and the management had indicated that some protective improvement had to be made in the system. The following day, out of the blue, Puharich had received a call from a company that was going bankrupt and wanted to dispose of a Faraday cage quickly and cheaply. They had bought it and instantly found that their channeling problems were solved, and the communications came through much more easily when they held their sessions inside the cage. This was one of the many synchronistic events, Jung's term for events that are meaningfully but non-causally connected. John said, which regularly happened in connection with their work, and which, for them, constituted further evidence of the objective reality of the management. When we were back in the sitting room and John had talked some more about the work, he finally got around to saying that he wondered whether our visit at this time was just a chance social call or another of those synchronistic events. Perhaps the management had their eyes on me, he said with a laugh. Perhaps they were behind this seemingly casual visit. Perhaps they wanted us to use me. They wanted to use me in some way. I wasn't very comfortable with the idea, which again reminded me of Trafalmador and the fate of poor Billy Pilgrim. That was that. I was in the States for a couple of weeks, but didn't pay another visit to Ossining. The visit had been an interesting experience, something to file away in memory for possible future use in some form or other. A few days after it, I had lunch in New York with a scientist from the Stanford Research Institute. He knew I knew he was familiar with the Ossining setup, and I asked him what he thought of it. It's either the most bizarre and crazy thing happening on this planet, or it's the most important, he said. He was one of the fence-sitters John had mentioned. To me, bizarre seemed just about the right word. That was just over a year ago, from the time of this writing. I had a busy year, having contracted to complete 3 books, and had virtually forgotten about Ossining and the management, when, one day in September 1975, I received a transatlantic call from John. The work we had talked about that Sunday when I visited, he said, had been progressing, and they had received definite indications from the management that it was time for a book about the communications to be written and published. Would I be interested? Of course, I didn't have to commit myself on the information I had at that time, but if I was interested in principle, he would send me some tapes of the communications to listen to, and we would be able to meet and discuss the project in a few weeks' time, when he would be in England. I agreed, considering that I had nothing to lose, and it would be interesting anyway to hear some of the communications, and a few days later the tapes arrived, together with some written background material about how the whole thing had started and the people involved in it. I received some odd looks and comments from my family in the course of the next few days. On several occasions my wife or one of the children came into my study while I was listening, and on hearing the queer sounds emanating from my hi-fi, quite forgot the purpose of the call. I'm regarded by friends and family as a fairly rational, intellectual type, and for me to be listening to communications with alleged space gods was considered amusingly offbeat. They soon became used to it, though, as I became used to the initial strangeness of the tapes. The strangeness is in the language, the syntax, the tone of the communications delivered through the channel, the medium Phyllis Schlemmer, and also sometimes in the manner of the communicants, who are mainly John and Andrija, which can be embarrassingly differential and odd. I felt sometimes that I was eavesdropping on a very private ritual, and skeptical questions kept occurring to me. Were these 2 clever men the dupes of a cleverer woman? It was a strange inconsistency that in many of the communications there was an excuse of that's and offs, and an excess of that's and offs, and a number of circumlocutions which sounded like a deliberate attempt to avoid literacy, whereas in others the language was incisive, uncluttered, and sometimes even quite eloquent and aphoristic. Also, when John or Andrija asked a difficult question, the voice often said, "We will consult," and there followed a long pause, during which the spokesman for the extraterrestrials was supposed to be telepathically communicating with his peers, but which could be a pause to give Phyllis an opportunity to think up an answer. As Tom Aquinas said, though not in so many words, it is unphilosophical, unscientific, and ultimately unintelligent to invoke a supernatural explanation of a phenomenon before you have eliminated every natural explanation. When confronted with the weird and wonderful, man's first reaction tends to be to try and rationalize it, and that's what I was doing all the time I was listening to those first tapes. I eventually became quite satisfied that the minimal hypothesis, that of a deliberate fraud or hoax, could be ruled out. I had some biological material on Phyllis and a tape of her talking about herself and her life, and I was satisfied not only that she could not possibly possess all the knowledge that she channeled, but also that she could have nothing to gain by deception, particularly as the sessions often severely depleted her physical and psychic energies. So my first hours of exposure to the communications convinced me that they were genuinely paranormal and of great interest. But the second minimal hypothesis was not so easily dismissed as the first. The second would be that they were naturally paranormal, that is to say, attributable to telepathy or the emergence of a secondary personality in the medium's trance state. There are many precedents in the annals of psychical research of mysterious communications of considerable length and showing great ingenuity and powers of invention which have come through mediums in trance. There is the Patience-Worth case, recorded by Dr. Walter Franklin Prince, in which a St. Louis housewife with an 8th grade education produced over a period of 5 years 1.5 million words by automatic writing, including long novels and poems and a wealth of aphrodisiac wit and wisdom, all in highly literate and colloquial 17th century English. There is the contemporary case of the Brazilian trance author Chico Xavier, who has produced something like 130 books, allegedly posthumous works of known Brazilian writers, which are consistent in style and subject matter with the works those authors wrote while alive. There is the book A Vision, which the wife of the poet W.B. Yeats wrote in trance, and which contains a cosmology, a philosophy, and a wealth of imagery that the poet drew on in composing some of his greatest work. And there is the case of the Reverend Stanton Moses' Spiritual Teachings, which has some remarkable correspondences with the Ossining communications. Between 1872 and 1883, Stanton Moses filled 24 notebooks with automatic writing. His communicators purported to be illustrious biblical characters, and they informed their amanuenses that a missionary effort to uplift the human race was being made in the spirit realms, and he had been chosen as a channel for their communications. These are 4 classic cases of automatism, and there are scores of others, and the conclusion that Prince reached in his study of the Patience-Worth material applies to all of them. Either our concept of what we call the subconscious mind must be radically altered so as to include potencies of which we hitherto have had no knowledge, or else some cause operating through but not originating in the subconscious of Mrs. Curran, the medium, must be acknowledged. The Ossining communications, it seemed to me after I had heard some hours of the recordings, posed the same dilemma. But this case differs from the other cases of paranormal communications above mentioned, in that the objective reality of the communicators is theoretically verifiable, for they claim to be actively engaged in the affairs of our world, to intervene in certain ways and to be able to predict future events. And as we shall see in later chapters, some of the statements, and particularly some of the predictions made in the communications, are very impressive. Another thing that puts this case in a different category from others is the amount of correlated activity the communications have already engendered. Among the first batch of tapes I listened to was one about a trip to the Middle East, which John, Andrija and Phyllis made in November 1974 at the request of the management. The purpose of the trip was nothing less than to help avert an imminent crisis in the Middle East by influencing the Russian leaders in Moscow by meditation, and the instructions of the management were that the 3 should make a crescent-shaped tour, keeping within 1,500 miles of Moscow, and should engage in meditation periodically in order to transmit the required psychic energy. To undertake such a trip obviously demanded a considerable investment, not only of money, but also of faith, trust, and on the face of it, the entire enterprise would appear to be crackpot and incredibly presumptuous. But the management said it was necessary, so off the 3 went, from New York to Helsinki, then to Warsaw, Ankara, Tehran, Moscow, and back via Copenhagen, where they were assured that their mission had been a success. In explaining their strategy of psychic influence, the communicators showed a shrewd insight into the Russian mind. They said, "It is an emotional mind, but with great love and strong meditation, a simple mind may be made to feel, and then in turn come to some sense. There is a difference between a simple mind that thinks it is intelligent and a simple mind that is simple in ignorance and with emotion. The Russian leaders are more emotional, and with meditation and strong prayer and a link with all, we can work on the emotion to stabilize it. The problem with Russia has always been the emotion. That's not a bad assessment for an extraterrestrial." So the quixotic travelers completed their journey, but they had no way of knowing for certain that their money and faith had been well invested, for at the start they had only the management's word for it that a crisis was imminent, and at the end they only had the management assurance that they had been instrumental in averting it. However, it is perhaps relevant to recall that there is a meditation room in the United Nations building in New York, and also that the great modern Indian saint Sri Aurobindo, a man of no mean intellectual capacity, claimed that the strengthening of the Russian resistance during the siege of Stalingrad was due to the power he generated through meditation. The idea of psychic influence on world events is not exclusive to our extraterrestrial friends and their Oceanic confederates. I have mentioned the 1974 Middle East adventure as an example of an action initiated by the communicators. There are other types of such actions, or rather programs, for work in these several areas is continuing. There are investigations of children who can produce the Geller effect, of bending with metal. There is work with psychic healers, and there is a research program involving dolphins and porpoises. Aquatic superminds also allegedly in service with the management. The work of the community and their associates ramifies in many directions and involves activities all over the world, some of which have been topics of public attention and debate over recent years. To pursue the ramifications of their story is to see emerge a portrait of an age, our age, a portrait in which are delineated its deepest concerns, its discoveries and adventures, its fears, hopes, longings, and yes, perhaps also its follies. Even the questions of the provenance, the authenticity, and the veridical content of the communications were put aside. The story would be worth telling just because it focuses and interrelates aspects of the emergent new consciousness of this end quarter of the 20th century. But in the end, the most exciting part of the story is the part that is most contentious, dubious, and hard to swallow. When the parapsychological and socio-cultural aspect of the case have been thoroughly explored, there remains to be considered the question whether the communications can conceivably be what they purport to be. Is there even a remote possibility that our planet has long been under the surveillance and occasionally under the direct influence of the intelligent forces from some other part of the cosmos? To do the communications justice, we have to venture into this area where speculation is rife and hard facts are difficult to come by. There's a vast literature about UFOs and extraterrestrial visitors to our planet, and to judge by the success of the books of Erich von Däniken, Powers and Berger, and Princely the Poet Trench, there is a large public avid to believe in the existence of the space gods. The unscholarly and wildly conjectural approach adopted in most of the UFOs literature has tended to polarize attitudes towards uncritical belief on the one hand and total rejections of the possibilities on the other. Rational men who want no truck with a lunatic fringe can scarcely be prevailed upon rationally to consider such evidence as there is for the existence and activities of extraterrestrials. Some may go as far as Carl Jung went in his 1947 essay, Flying Saucers, and concede that UFOs have a kind of objective existence as psychic exteriorization phenomena, and that the worldwide sightings of them over recent decades was symptomatic of a wave of hope in the reappearance of Christ. Religions, of course, have always taught the existence of a supramundane intelligence and divine intervention in human affairs and history, so the idea is not unfamiliar. And if we take a look beyond the popular literature and the scholarly acrimony it has engendered, and shelf the plausible Jungian hypothesis for a time, we find that a surprising number of people who are in a position to be better informed than most do not find the idea of the existence and interventions of extraterrestrials inherently implausible. When I had listened to the first batch of tapes and had begun to take seriously the possibility of venturing upon the present book, I sought through books immediately to hand in my own modest library, and within half an hour turned up a number of facts that began to erode my basic skepticism about extraterrestrials. I found, for instance, that in 1971, an international conference sponsored jointly by the American and Russian Academies of Science had been convened in Armenia and had launched Project Cyclops, an international research project on the practical possibilities and foreseeable consequences of establishing contact with extraterrestrial beings. The following year, a symposium entitled Life Beyond Earth and the Mind of Man was organized by Professor Richard Berenson of Boston University. Professor Berenson, an astronomer, stated that recent developments in the sciences strongly indicate the high probability of the existence of extraterrestrial life. He had also suggested, I learned, that an effective way of communicating with extraterrestrials might be through psychic channels, and in a book co-authored by Professor Carl Sagan of Cornell and Professor Joseph Shklovsky of Moscow University, entitled Intelligent Life in the Universe, the suggestion is put forward that the ancient Sumerians may have had contact with the space people. The researchers of the philosopher-mathematician Dr. Charles Moses, who into ancient mythology and symbolism point to the same conclusion. So I break this here because the chapters are much longer than our recently read. This is chapter 1, Preposterous Proposition, a book by Stuart Holroyd about the prelude to the landing on planet Earth.